and he will talk about some of the challenges in the new world of one of the more interesting and controversial aspects of fintech, which is to say the world of cryptocurrencies, whether it's the more volatile cryptos or the so-called stable coins or central bank digital currencies. All of you know who Brian is. He was the CEO of Binance. He was the CIO of Coinbase. And he started life as a lawyer, and he was acting controller of the currency. And it is my honor and pleasure to now turn it over to Brian. Thank you.
Well, Henny, thanks so much. And Dr. June and others, thanks so much for having me back. This is one of the great groups of the world, and it's a real honor to be able to speak here. Since I've only got 10 minutes, let me just take 30 seconds, and I'll try and make a transition from Barry's comments to the topic that I want to talk about. Let me just begin by picking up on a word in Henny's introduction about the controversial nature of crypto, or as Barry was talking about, the controversial nature of technology's migration into the banking system. One of the things that I always found interesting, both before I was the US bank regulator and while I was holding that role, is how interesting it is that the incumbent banks apparently are the non-controversial option. Just during the brief period that I was the controller of the currency, I authorized nearly $1 billion in fines against the incumbent system. But we seem to take that as table stakes, and the innovators somehow are the controversial ones. So I'm going to suggest as we go through this conversation that we should flip that script. And just because status quo bias is a heuristic that we've learned about through behavioral economics, we shouldn't assume that the status quo situation, the status quo, I would argue, is highly risky, sometimes corrupt, and has its own issues. And so when we assess new entrants, we shouldn't only look at the incremental risks they're creating. We should also look at the net risk relative to the status quo and ask ourselves, are we better with them or without them? I would just say that by way of introduction. So what I want to do is talk about what I think the two most important trends in financial services are, one of which has to do with everything Barry just talked about, and the other of which has to do with what I'm about to talk about. And those trends are both created by major technology developments of the last 25 years. One of them is the trend of unbundling. Unbundling is the concept that financial services that historically were provided together no longer need to be provided together. And what I'm really talking about are the classical three banking services of deposit taking, payments, and lending. So if you think about some of the issues that Barry was talking about, the worry, for example, a large tech company like Facebook might get into payments, or in a prior incarnation, the worry that a big company like Walmart might get into lending. These ideas scare people, but the interesting thing about it is that the reason that those firms see those opportunities is that there is now a technology ability to source liquidity without relying on your own deposit gathering base as your source of funds for either making loans or clearing payments. That is a major innovation, which may or may not be a good thing, but it is a macro trend that explains why fintech exists. It couldn't have existed 50 years ago, because 50 years ago, there was no efficient way to gather liquidity anywhere other than on a deposit-taking vertical platform like a bank. But now there obviously is, hence the world of fintech. And indeed, in some ways, fintech is just an extension of the famous old article about whether banks are special, where one of the topics that was treated was the idea that all three of those services historically had to be provided together. But with the advent of the corporate debt market in the 80s, suddenly it wasn't so clear. Okay, so that's one of the trends that explains Barry's topic of fintech. The other major trend, also facilitated by technology, is the trend toward decentralization. Now, if there was any question that this is a trend, I can quickly disabuse you of it by talking about what happened with information in the early and mid-90s with the advent of the original internet. That was the internet that killed post offices and killed libraries as sources of information exchange, where now we can all get all information in the world on our laptops without having to source any central repository of information. And in the early 2000s and the mid 2000s, the world of commerce was similarly disrupted. So nobody goes to JCPenney anymore, or whatever your department store is in your home country. Now everything can be ordered and delivered to us at the click of a button, or at least before the current supply chain crisis, that was the case. All of that is because the efficiency of aggregating large amounts of stuff, whether the stuff is information or commercial items that a retailer would house in a warehouse, or I would argue money, no longer has to be aggregated on one platform and then farmed out by a central administrator. And so if we agree radically changed information and commerce, the question is, why wouldn't we think that decentralization will bring major changes to the world of finance? Now, one answer could be because we just fetishize finance and think about it as different from every other commodity. That's a topic beyond the scope of 10 minutes. But I would argue that if you think about money as just another commodity, if you believe that money is not any different from precious metals or retail goods or books in a library, there's no reason to think that it would not be more efficiently distributed by networks than it is by vertically integrated entities like banks. So with that said, let me talk just for a minute about what the project of crypto is all about, because I find that this is one of the most misunderstood ideas in finance today. So to Henny's point, I want to talk about the idea that there really are 4 different kinds of things that might be called cryptocurrencies. One of them is Bitcoin, which is really unique in all the world. Bitcoin is really not like any other cryptocurrency. I say that because although Bitcoin was originally built to prove the possibility of a decentralized network used for the exchange of value, in reality, for a bunch of technology reasons that probably are beyond the scope of this talk, what Bitcoin has turned out to be is most important for its algorithmic rationing mechanism. So as Henny and I were discussing before we got on today's conference, the thing that has made Bitcoin so valuable, and in particular so very much more valuable over the last 18 months, is because Bitcoin cannot be debased. No one can make Bitcoin print more Bitcoin than the algorithm allows. And in the last 18 months, central banks around the world have printed a lot of fiat currency. So as the supply of dollars and yen and won and every other thing goes through the roof, and Bitcoin continues its slow rise toward its eventual cap of 21 million tokens, naturally the scarcity of Bitcoin relative to other things will make the Bitcoin more valuable. And that's one of the most significant explanations for why Bitcoin as a special category is its own thing. So that's Bitcoin. Let's put that off to one side, okay? The second kind of crypto token, which is almost every other kind of crypto token, is basically something you should think of as like an internet stock. So if you're wondering why does Ethereum have value, or Solana, or Cardano, or any of those other tokens that occasionally make the front page of the Wall Street Journal, the answer is because every one of those tokens has one of 2 properties. It is either a reward for people to connect computing power to a network so that the network can be maintained on a decentralized basis. Remember, the current internet is largely controlled by 5 big tech companies, but the Ethereum blockchain is controlled by hundreds of thousands of Ethereum miners, all of whom are unrelated to each other. And it's the Ethereum token that rewards them for doing that work. Whereas, Google gets paid through the appreciation of its stock to maintain server farms, but you and I might connect our computers up to the Ethereum blockchain because we're going to get rewarded with Ethereum tokens. So some of these internet stocks are your reward for creating the underlying network. So you might think of Ethereum as not that different from Google stock. And then other of these tokens are basically applications that sit on top of an underlying network. So you might think of the Filecoin token as which sits on top of another network as an example of this. It's an application to create a decentralized cloud. And there's an underlying internet on which it sits, much like the applications on your phone require the underlying internet to function. So that's the second category of crypto token. It's a network. It's basically an internet stock. The third kind of crypto token that we talk about, and Henny adverted to, is the concept of the stable coin. These are cryptographic codes that travel on an underlying blockchain, for example, Ethereum or Solana. But these particular tokens are issued by somebody with the promise that if you deliver that token back, the token will be redeemed based on the value of an underlying reference asset, usually fiat currency, although not always fiat currency. So the concept of a stablecoin in that respect is very much like an internet version of a traveler's check or a prepaid card or any other, a money order and any other representation of value, the actual value of which is stored in some underlying bank someplace. That's what a stablecoin is. Which brings me to the last form of crypto token, which is a central bank digital currency. Now we can talk more about this, and I know you all will talk more about this in your dialogue when I'm done speaking. But there is in the world a significant debate between proponents of stablecoins, such as myself, and proponents of central bank digital currencies like most central bankers. Now, it won't surprise you to know that as all bureaucrats exist to expand their jurisdiction, and trigger warning, I was no different, so it's not a criticism, but obviously central bankers want central bank digital currencies because it allows them to clear transactions and it allows them to maintain their control over the payment system, et cetera, et cetera. What I always ask in these questions, though, is whether or not we think that is such an obviously good thing. Do we think it is obviously good that the Federal Reserve controls the United States payment system? So I come back to a comment that Barry made at the very end of his talk, where he noted that a scary thing that could happen in a world of tech is that Facebook could go down for 8 hours because of a software development glitch. But I would remind everyone that less than a year ago, Fedwire went down for more than 7 hours, and Fedwire processes $10 trillion a day of transactions. So again, if we somehow think that the status quo is the risk-free scenario, I would urge you to revisit that assumption. It's true that Facebook can go down. It's also true that banks and even central banks can go down. And so the question is, what is the net effect of having a decentralized network for payment processing versus a central bank administered system for payment processing? I would point out that the internet itself has never gone down. Yes, individual companies that plug into it have gone down, but the internet itself has never failed because networks can lose 30, 40, and 50% of their nodes and still function. Whereas if the OCC gets hacked, if the Fed gets hacked, if the Korean central bank gets hacked, the entire system can collapse. Hence my belief that decentralization is one of the profound changes in finance, as it was in commerce, as it was in information, and thus crypto, which powers the decentralization of the financial system, is likely to grow and have value over time. So Henny, I could go on for much longer on all these topics, but hopefully touching on it lightly at that level at least introduces the topic enough to have a conversation.
I'm going to ask you one quick question, and then I'll let you go with great regret, and that is, in 10 years, will the international monetary system as we know it today still exist? Will the US dollar be the world's reserve currency? Will SWIFT and the pipes of the infrastructure of the traditional monetary system still be there?
Yeah, I would say the answer is no. I think that in that amount of time, the system will look radically different. Now, you asked a series of component questions in there, so which of those things will be different? Well, first of all, I would remind people that only 20 years ago, dollars represented 72% of all reserves held by central banks globally. Today, that number is 59%. So in tech, we talk a lot about the theory of gradually, then suddenly. And what I would tell you is the dollar still is the reserve currency today because 59% is still a significant majority of all reserve currencies, and it's much larger than the next one. But I would also point out that 59% is a lot less than 72%. And there is a number out there, and I don't know if it's 51% or 47% or what it is, but at a certain point, it will suddenly cease to be the store of value globally, and that will be a problem if you don't plan for it. So that is one thing for sure. The second thing is you already see with the development of central bank digital currencies and networks in individual competitor nations that the system as it is today, the system governed by the Bank for International Settlements and the Basel Committee, is changing significantly. SWIFT is a product of that system, right? SWIFT is just an interbank agreement to accept messages from people who have codes, right? And at a certain point, SWIFT fails a lot. SWIFT has certain chargeback risk, takes a long time, it's pretty expensive, and it gets hacked fairly readily. Not obvious why that will succeed when the adoption rate of blockchains and other kinds of networked technologies are growing so fast. So Henny, I would say that people who believe the current system will always be the system, don't remember the past, and aren't sufficiently aware of the future.
Thank you so much. I reluctantly let you go, and we move on